Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we are diving into the life and career of Conway Twitty, so stick around. All right, but first, I got some dates coming up, so come on out and see me. I will be October 9th. I will be at Tano's in Orangevale. And then October 16th, we're coming to Nashville, doing the Ryman Plaza stage ahead of the Jason Isbell show. So if you're in town, come on out and see us. And then October 24th, I'll be back at Red Bus Brewing in Folsom. And then November 1st, I'll be at the R Wagon Bar in Browns Valley for their Halloween party, which will include a costume contest, so wear your best. And then November 11th, I will be at Harrah's Northern California in Ione. So if you're around, come on out and see us. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler & Co. _marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. So Conway Twitty is, in the list of characters that we've done, he seems to have, I mean, if you could do it right career-wise, I think he's the closest one to kind of doing that. And, I mean, tragically, he still dies young, so I don't know, how that balances out with the universe. But he's kind of this relatively, straight and narrow dude. He never gets into drugs. He never gets into alcohol. He doesn't have any run-ins with the law. He's a pretty straight and narrow guy with a string of hits here. And he bounces into some of our other stories and stuff. But so he's born in 1933 as Harold Lloyd Jenkins was his name in Arkansas. And and his childhood is pretty, sounds like it was a pretty good childhood for him. He gets a little bit involved musically, but not really. Like, he's not doing... That's not his claim to fame. He was a baseball guy throughout his high school career, to the point where he actually gets not drafted, but he gets picked up by the Philadelphia Phillies they're not to play pro yet, but it was in their farm system. So the Phillies are looking at him to come play for them after high school, and he accepts that. So his plan was to go, do his best to play professional baseball, but then he gets drafted during the Korean War. So he goes to Japan. So he's not in a combat role here. And in Japan in the 50s, America is like the occupying force, just rebuilding Japan. So he's able, at that point, to kind of stretch his legs musically a little bit, and he starts a band called the Cimarrons. And he spends that 2 years basically just hanging out in Japan and playing music and, just doing his day job at the army kind of thing. And, but anyway, right around this time is where, we talk about, the impact that other artists have on each other. Conway Twitty's entire life gets changed when he hears Elvis Presley. So he's hearing of Elvis while he's in Japan, because this is 1954 to 56 is when he's in Japan. And that 54 to 56, if you remember, is right when Elvis is at Sun Records. So he leaves Sun Records in 56 or late 55, I think. But I think he got there in 53. So that's like right when Elvis is picking up steam, is while, Harold Jenkins is in Japan in the army. And so when he gets home, the Phillies are still willing to have him join their program. And they make that offer to him again. And he turns it down because he's decided, just from hearing Elvis and having been in a band in Japan, he decides, nope, I'm done with baseball as a career. I'm doing music. And, which is a wild, in the timeline, it seems there's like this little blip of like, oh, he's exposed to Elvis and decides he wants to do music. And then the story continues. But I don't know if you can imagine being a 20-year-old kid just hearing Elvis and deciding, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to move to Memphis and I'm going to try to be a rock star. And, but he does, like, he just pulls the trigger on that deal, and he ends up at Sun Records. So so he's not Conway yet. He's still Harold Jenkins. Ends up at Sun Records in 1956, right around, so like that's the year we've talked about ad nauseum on this show, and at Sun Records in 1956 is when you've got Roy Orbison, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash. Elvis isn't there, but he's not signed to Sun Records anymore, but he's around. Like, this is when the $1 Million Quartet happens. Harold Jenkins is around as that's all going down, and he's making connections in the rock, I guess is rock and roll space. And the problem is that Sam Phillips decides that Leroy Jenkins, that Harold Jenkins sounds too much like Elvis Presley, like his, the way he was, his vocal performances at the time. He was really kind of trying to be Elvis, to the point where Sam Phillips felt like, we can't really use this guy that well because he sounds too much like Elvis. And to the point where I think It's Only Make Believe, I think, was people so that's a couple of years later in 1958, he does It's Only Make Believe, and people actually mistook him for Elvis. Like, a lot of people thought that was an Elvis record, but it wasn't. So, but he's still at Sun Records, and he is getting involved in writing, and he's kind of part of the creative process there. And he ends up collaborating with Roy Orbison, which, for the song, I don't have it written down here. But, so he and actually at one point, the song, which I have somewhere in my notes here that's not coming to my eye yet, but Roy Orbison cuts this song, and Sam Phillips gave it to him without talking to Conway. He just decided, this is going to be a Roy song, even though Conway had cut his version of it. And so he kind of felt a little bit backstabbed by that, but he still gets a writing credit, and he's still, it's still good for his career. But Sam Phillips kind of shelved him and was like, hey, you're too much like Elvis. We're just going to, give this one to Roy. And, but he's touring with those guys. He's around all those, like the club scene with Johnny Cash and Roy Orbison and all these guys. Like, he's part of that whole process. But this is where, I think in late 56, I think, he is basically done at Sun Records because they're not going to play his records, and he needs to kind of reinvent himself. And this is where Harold Jenkins and the people around him decide, you need a different name, because Harold Jenkins doesn't sound like a rock star. And that's, and this is where you get the story of Conway looking at a map and just picking the names of two random towns. I don't know if he was throwing a dart or how his eyes found the names of these towns, but it was Conway, I think it was Conway, Arkansas, and Twitty, Texas were the two towns that he just like, A, B, I'm Conway Twitty now. And so is born Conway Twitty. And then in 1950, so he I think he gets picked up by MGM Records at some point in here. And so his he releases It's Only Make Believe as Conway Twitty at MGM. And this is where his career really starts to kind of pick up and take off here. So he has kind of gotten to where he wanted to be. And I think that was his first number one. The song goes to number one as a pop song. And then he kind of just starts stringing hits together here. And he's writing, he's part of the writing process, but Conway's another one of these guys who just knew how to pick songs that were kind of farmed through the writing staff at some of these record labels. He just knew how to pick good ones and put records together. And his delivery was, some of the other artists we talked about, like George Jones and some of these guys who didn't write a lot of their stuff, but their delivery was just undeniable. And so that's kind of who Conway is developing into here. But he's more involved in the writing process than guys like George Jones or like Kenny Rogers especially, or kind of some of these other cats that are floating around the scene here. And so in 1960, he gets another top 10 hit with a Lonely Blue Boy, and he starts to appear in films. He's starting to get some film credits under his belt here. One of which I haven't looked at this one at all, but some of the titles are pretty funny. Where it's one of them is College Confidential, Sex Kittens Go to College, which I don't know what that movie's about, but it might be worth a look. And then another one called Platinum High School. And so he's experiencing some success. Right before this, actually, he had gotten married briefly. If I can find the dates here, because he gets married and he has a son that I think his name was Michael, and but that marriage doesn't last very long. It lasts for a year, not even. And he gets custody of the kid. So, and you'll see that guy pop up in interviews and stuff as Michael Twitty, even though his name is Jenkins. And so Conway keeps his, on the family side, his he doesn't change his family name. That's his stage name. So his wives and kids are all still Jenkins. But like I said, you see at least Michael starts using the name Twitty just to kind of keep his association, I guess. But I think he was born somewhere around 1960, I think. And, but anyway, so his first marriage is pretty short-lived, but he does have a son. And later on here, he gets remarried. And that marriage lasts a pretty long time. There's some drama in here, but his second marriage is the one that really kind of is with him for the ride. So the highs and lows of getting discovered and being on the road all the time and being away from home. He has, I think, 3 more kids with his second wife. And let's see if I can find it in my notes here. Let's see. But yeah, so he has 3 more kids, and his career is starting to kind of take off here. Now, this is where he starts to kind of spread his wings a little bit with other business ventures. He doesn't just stick to music. He starts getting into. He has a bunch of different things that kind of don't work that well. He owned a burger chain at one point that was I think it was Twitty's Burgers or something. It was, but it doesn't go very well. But you start to see at one point with the burger chain, I think it was the burger chain, he got other country music artists to buy into this thing. And then when it went south, he could have just declared bankruptcy and, kind of told guys, hey, your investment is toast, and legally he would have been in the clear to do that. But he didn't. So basically what he does is he, out of his own personal finances, pays back all the investors that were involved in the burger business. And like I said, he didn't have to do that. And then what he ends up doing is he kind of gets himself caught in a little bit of legal proceeding here where, so he pays back the other investors and then he writes off that payment as a business expense on his music side, and the IRS throws a fit about like how that's not a write-off or whatever. He ends up taking that to court, and the court says, yeah, that actually is a write-off because he was saving his reputation, and the reputation in the music business is something worth protecting, and that like using his finances for that was acceptable. So he ends up able to write that off as expenses later. But like I said, that was kind of it seems to have been a good snapshot of the kind of dude that he was. Like, he wasn't just out here trying to make money hand over fist, regardless of who it impacted. He felt a moral obligation to his other, like the other artists that were involved, to pay them back because he didn't want to just be that guy. And so, that seems to work. And by the, throughout his whole life, everybody, you're hard pressed to find anybody that has something bad to say about Conway Twitty. He seems to have been a really stand-up dude. And even though he's gone a lot, his kids love him, and he's this very, like, family-oriented guy. He ends up, kind of as his career is, in full swing here, he buys, like, a family compound so he buys this big piece of property, and he's building houses on it for all of his kids and his wife, he and his wife are in the mansion initially. And his mom gets a house on the property, and and they kind of open it up as like a tourist attraction, which apparently that caused some issues because it was like fans could just show up and get a tour of the house that his wife is living in at the time. And not just the house, but like the whole grounds. Kind of the same way I think Loretta Lynn did a similar kind of deal. Like back in our Loretta Lynn episode, we talked about that's how Jack White met Loretta Lynn, was just like he saw a sign that you can go like tour her house. Like it sounds like this is something that people did back then. Which I mean, it's kind of wild these days. I mean, it's like especially at the time, that'd be like just driving through Texas somewhere and you see a sign that's like George Strait's house, and you could just go pay $15 and tour his living room, which is like an insane idea now, but back then that's what they did. But anyway, so let me see here. Yeah, so through the 50s, his next three kids are born, let's see, 1958, 1960, 57, 58, 1960 are those next three kids that are born. His wife's name was Temple Medley, but everyone called her Mickey. And they get married, I think, in 1956, like tail end of 1956 here. So, like I said, she's with him in the very beginning through all of this stuff. And like I said, despite being gone all the time, his family they describe him as like a good dad and a good family man. He was always taking care of people. His kids talk about how he would go on these long tour stretches and he'd get home at like 2 a.m. or midnight or something and just go knock on his kid's door. And they're like, what are you doing? He's like, well, I just got home. I just wanted to see you for a few minutes. Like, I missed you guys kind of thing. So like, that's the kind of guy he is. He's like showing up, he wanted his family around him. He built this like compound where all of his kids and grandkids could be in the same spot. And he was serious about it. And he'd go check on his kids as soon as he got home, which, is touching. Let's see here. So yeah, and he called it Twitty City is the like colloquial name for his family compound deal. And through here he starts to, like I can remember the date here that he gets paired up with Loretta Lynn. Let's see here, because Hello Darlin' comes out in 1970. And this is also in 1970 is where his marriage hits the rocks for the first time here. So, like I said, it had been happy but strained because he's gone all the time. And in 1970, he gets divorced briefly. Like, for like less than a year. So he gets divorced from Mickey, and it sounds like that, like I said, she's home all the time. His fans are coming through, and they kind of have access to her whole life, and she's just not into it at all. And so they get divorced, but that kind of turns around. They get remarried, and they stay married after that divorce for another like 14 years or something. It's a long time. And let's see here. So 71 is when he gets paired up with Loretta Lynn, and this is where you get that moment that we talked about in the Loretta Lynn episode where she's like in the control room at the studio, and the producer is like, "Hey, what do you think of Conway Twitty?" And she's just, "Oh, I just love Conway to death." And and he's like, "Well, would you want to meet him?" And she's kind of like, "Oh, I don't know, I'd be a mess." And he's like, "Well, he's right here." He kind of brings him into the room, and they get to meet each other, and he was a fan of her, she was a fan of him, and they kick off this partnership that lasts many years, and they're just on a run of hits. Like, everything they touch is doing great on the charts, and like they get the nickname the Diamond Duo because of their harmonies and everything, and that seems to be a really, it's a giant positive part of both of their careers, is them teaming up. And let's see here, but there's another, so because things, just for context, after Conway dies, things get really weird. Like, it's one of the worst estate fights in country music history ensues after Conway dies. And in talking about that, the kids point to, in 1981, Conway Twitty stepped out of his tour bus, slips, and hits his head on the steps of his tour bus, and hard. The driver of the tour bus said it sounded like a gunshot went off, and it was his head bouncing off the step of the tour bus. And he's like, bleeding everywhere. He's on the, so he, physically, he heals from that totally fine. It doesn't seem like that big of a event. But his family all say that his personality changed afterward, and that some of that happy-go-lucky guy persona disappears at this stage when he whacks his head really hard. And so, because they kind of see that as like, that's where everything went wrong, is when he hits his head. He changes so much as a person, it finishes off his marriage, basically, because they get divorced again. Let's see here. It's going to be in the late 80s, I think, is when they get divorced again. So this is also where we start to see the next. So his wife, the woman that he gets remarried here to a woman named Dee Henry. And there's a bunch of, you start to see the happy family image sort of start to kind of grind and crumble a little bit here, because Dee was only 6 years older than the first daughter that gets born. So I think the daughter was born in 50, what did we say that was? But anyway, so his third wife is only, I think, 6 years older than his oldest daughter and 8 years older than the next one. And there's some kind of overlap here where Dee had been friends with his daughter. Like, that's how they met, was his daughter was staying with an uncle or something briefly, and for like a summer, and this other girl was around the house. I don't know if she was like one conversation I saw made it sound like she might have been like a child from a previous marriage to the wife of Conway's brother or something. Like, so like I said, his daughter is staying with her aunt and uncle, and this other girl is in the house, and it sounds like she was the aunt's child from a previous marriage. So she's not blood related to the Jenkins family, but so her, and I think it was Kathy, is the daughter that she was close to. And they're kind of, friends. She's around the house. They're hanging out together. Well, I think in 1984, if I'm not mistaken, Conway hires D. Henry as a receptionist around the, or Twitty City or whatever. Like he kind of brings her in as a, as an employee, and they end up getting married, I think, in 1986. So 3 years after his final divorce from Mickey. And she's, 20-something years younger than him. And it initially, that does two things. It irritates his daughter because she felt like Dee was like, she's kind of looking at this person like, hey, I thought you were my friend. Why are you getting involved with my dad? Like, what is... So she's angry at Dee on that angle. And she also, all the kids sort of see her as dashing the hopes of Mickey and Conway getting back together at some point. So it's like the family is not stoked about Dee entering the scene here. And then this is where you kind of, different interviews and different documentaries paint two very different pictures of what's going on here. Because on one end, you have, and what would have probably been closer to Conway's point of view at the time, he really seems to fall head over heels for Dee. And they become this like inseparable couple, and she's involved in everything. She's on tour with him. She's doing, booking. She's involved in production. She's like giving him notes, and she's like at every recording session. She's like both feet in, fully committed. They become like this power couple sort of, despite, their giant age difference, but that's it. All the footage of them, they're like holding hands and she's rubbing on them, and they're clearly super affectionate to each other all the time. They're never apart from each other. And, their marriage isn't relatively, it's not that long because, he dies in 1993 and I think they got married in 86. So it's not that long, but he really seems to have been super into her. And that was, he describes her as the love of his life, and he's totally happy with how all of this has shook down. And then there's a conversation with his daughter, I think Kathy, where she's basically like sort of coming to terms with this deal. And now she kind of had to go through this forgiving moment and telling Conway, look, like, if that's how you feel, and if you, love her that way, I love you, and I will find room in my heart to love this person, even though I'm kind of irritated at how this all went down. And so it almost looks like everything's going to be okay. The family's kind of coming back together. People are, getting used to how the new dynamic is going to be. They understand that Mickey and Conway are never going to get back together. And like I said, it starts to feel like things might be okay here. Well, that's until Conway dies, and that was in 1993, and we talked about this on the Loretta Lynn episode. So he's experiencing success like the whole time through. I mean, if you think about it, it's pretty nuts that Conway Twitty had #1 hits in 4 different decades. He had like the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he's able to adapt to a really changing landscape musically. He just hangs in there and kind of does everything right on the music front. He's he teams up with Loretta Lynn, and they have this powerhouse career together. And then out of nowhere, I think it was in Missouri, he tells Dee he feels some like pressure in his side. And she's like, well, maybe we should go to the hospital. And he's like, no, it's not that bad. And at this point, you got to remember too that he was never a drug user. He didn't drink. And on top of that, Dee had taken a real interest in his health, and he was like exercising all the time. She was really worried about his, diet and everything. She was pretty locked in on keeping him healthy, and he was the healthiest he'd ever been, at least in his opinion at the time. And so when he says, I've got this weird pressure in my side, it's like, you can imagine anybody that is like, my side feels kind of weird. And you're like, all right, well, this dude doesn't smoke. He doesn't drink. He doesn't have any like risk factors for anything. Like it's almost weird to be like, go to the emergency room right now, which turns out that's what they should have done, because he basically tells Dee, if it's not better tomorrow, maybe I'll go get checked out. Well, that night he collapses on his tour bus and, is rushed off to the hospital because he's having what they would come to find out was an abdominal aortic aneurysm. So, like we've talked about before, basically his heart just like blew a hose and he's just dumping blood into his chest cavity. And that's even now, that's a pretty tough thing to survive, especially if he was already having enough of that where he's feeling pressure while he's conscious. So by the time he falls down, it's way too late to do anything about this. So he ends up in the hospital, and I think the hospital was they take him to Springfield. And we've told this part of the story before, where it just out of pure coincidence, he ends up at the Springfield hospital where Loretta Lynn is already there, because her husband, Doolittle, was there for, I think it was a heart surgery, or it was related to his diabetes. It was either he was having a heart issue, or, because I don't think he was there, because he got a bunch of amputations done at some point, but I don't think that's what it was. He was unconscious, I think, because he was there for a heart surgery. So Loretta Lynn is just at this hospital in Springfield. And to clear up some confusion, I got a lot of flack online for this. Doolittle does not die here. He doesn't die in the same hospital as Conway. He survives his procedure and dies 3 years later. But anyway, Loretta's in here in the hospital, and she just gets told, hey, Conway just came in. So she's running up and down. He's on like the floor below, I guess. So she's like running back and forth to the different rooms, like checking on her husband, checking on Conway. And this is where they tell her, hey, you need to go say goodbye. And she initially is like, no, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't have the gas for this. Like, but she brings herself to do it, partly because she wanted to be there emotionally for Dee. So she, she's with Conway's wife as this is all going down. And she tells a story, Loretta Lynn makes it sound like she's running down there, she says, her little piece to him, I guess, which was more of words of encouragement. Like, she's still trying to tell him, like, hey, like, you're going to be all right, like, hang in there, and then she runs up to check on her husband again, and they tell her, hey, Conway just died. So she runs back downstairs, and she says that she was in the room with him, and she had just heard through her life, like, she thought, like, your spirit sort of hangs out around your body for a second when you die. And so there's this moment where Loretta Lynn is in the room with now dead Conway Twitty, and she's yelling up at the ceiling, Conway, come back down here. Like, come back down. Stay here. Like, she's, like, yelling to what she perceived as his spirit in the room, which, obviously, he stays dead. Like, that, it doesn't work, but it's this sort of sweet last attempt at, talking to her friend. And so, like I said, so Conway dies in 1993. And that's sad enough. Like, it's tragic enough that a dude at the top of his career, because his career hadn't, like, slowed down at all. He was, selling out shows and touring with, all these other, and Loretta, and, like, they had plans for more music to come out later. And there was, it wasn't like his career had really tapered off that much. He was, not necessarily at the peak, but he's still a very prominent public figure. And so he dies, and almost immediately things go to absolute hell on the legal front, because come to find out, he had not updated his will, which was a problem, because the last time he updated it was to just write out his ex-wife in whenever he got divorced the last time in 81, I think, or 1980, something like that. And so he updates it to, like, not include his ex-wife in the will anymore, but he doesn't go back to update it when he gets remarried. So Dee is not in the will at all, which, the kids were, like I said, when you get through these kind of legal fights, the best side of people does not come out. So, like, any ability for them to, like, coexist and kind of bury the hatchet on anything just get scrapped, and the knives are out, and everybody's after the money. And so they start doing things to each other where it really depends on what your perspective is, how you would justify some of the courses of action taken here. Because, like, soon after he dies, you can go, like, if you find, like, the Life and Times of Conway Twitty on YouTube, they're interviewing Dee and his first son, Michael. And they make it sound like this really sweet, you know, it's a tribute to Conway, and Michael's talking about how much he loved Dee and how they were this happy couple and all this other stuff. Like, there's no darkness in there mentioned at all in that TV special. And you might, you know, the other 3 kids are conspicuously missing from that special. Well, it's because when that was filmed, they were knee deep in this nasty legal battle where Michael sort of sides with Dee because I guess in his mind, she was his dad's wife. If he'd have gotten around to it, he would have written her into that will, and like he should have. He just didn't think he was going to die randomly when he was feeling the healthiest he'd ever felt. So Michael felt like he didn't exclude Dee on purpose. He meant to get around to it and just never did. The other kids don't feel that way at all. Like, they feel like Dee is this woman who swooped in after, you know, like they were already mad at her for being like a friend of Kathy's that sort of swooped their dad away from, you know, and even though his divorce was finalized before they ever got together, they sort of felt like Dee was the one that slammed the door on the hopes of him and Mickey ever getting back together. So that raises its head, despite the fact that they had told their dad that they would, you know, bury the hatchet over that deal. That comes back up, and I think it's hard to tell. I think that the other 3 kids would have been happy to just write Dee off completely and not give her a dime. Like, I don't think they were in it to just, like, fairly distribute stuff. I think they were not operating 100% in good faith here on that front. I think they were trying to get the last blow in that fight. Well, Tennessee law at the time said that even without the will, Dee is entitled to like 30% of the estate, which is a giant number. I mean, especially at the time. And also, too, there's a bunch of weird shenanigans that go on with like the executors of the will. Basically, you can imagine Conway dies, and he's got this whole like family compound with all these his mom lives in one of the houses, and him and Dee live in the mansion, and then the other houses have his other kids and their families. And so they go into this meeting to read the will. When they walk into the room, everybody is sad, but sort of on the same page, kind of like, okay, we'll see what Dad said to do here. And that's where they find out Dee realizes she's in a fight for her financial future at all. And the kids are told during this meeting, hey, that's because Conway's paying his children a salary. Like he's covering he's helping them out financially, like as I guess any good dad would do. They're, employees of his corporation, I guess, and he's paying all of them a monthly salary. In this meeting, all of the kids find out, hey, the money just stopped. We can't pay any of your salaries during probate, and the money's not there anymore. And so they walk in thinking, how are we going to just settle this financial thing? And they walk out of there suddenly with their income slashed and staring down the possibility of having to give a giant chunk of their dad's estate to Dee, who they did not like. So it just sets them up for this nasty response. And then Dee also gets the message immediately that, oh, the other people in this room want me cut out. So she starts being super aggressive and super, like, not the best version of herself here. Because it's a long process, and it would get figured out in courts much later. But, like, she starts doing things like basically to figure out what the estate is worth. So she's told you're entitled to 30% of the estate. Well, how do you know how much the estate is worth? Because it's not as simple as like I think I saw one video where a guy says, like, if you have like a glove, right? A glove at the hardware store might cost, a pair of gloves or $10 or whatever. But if it's Conway Twitty's glove, that's worth more than $10 to somebody. But the only way to figure out how much it's worth is to auction it. To figure, so they don't actually know what the estate is worth until you start auctioning things off. And Dee says, all right, do it. And she just triggers an auction to sell off everything, which is that is, I don't know how mad you have to be to uproot your husband's entire family, but she does. So Twitty City is shut down to the point where like Conway's mom, who was alive at the time and she was in her 80s and living in this house on the property, is like told, hey, you got to get out. Like, not only get out, but get out and have no financial support. Like, go find somewhere else to live. So Dee has no problem with this, which she starts to really look the part of the greedy new wife as this process drags on, which is really unfortunate because, like, had Conway been alive, there was no issues here. And they really did seem to have this, like, loving relationship. So, like, but like I said, it's just this nasty example of, like, the knives just coming out for the money, and everybody is just doing their best to get what they can out of this process. And so, but then, and people kind of start taking sides, and there's, a bunch of drama around who gets what. So like they have this auction, and they're auctioning off everything, like down to like pictures, like at one moment, so Mickey ends up at this auction to like support her kids, and they're all like I said, they're out of money, so they're all like, the estate gave them as like a okay. So part of the way they were gonna like smooth this over, even though they had to trigger the auction, the executors of the estate said, okay, we're gonna give the kids, I think it was $50,000 to spend at this auction to buy their dad's stuff back from the estate. And they gave Dee $100,000 to do the same, which is nuts. Like, so they're getting their dad's money to buy their dad's stuff back from the auction, which is like a weird thing. Anyway, so Mickey ends up in here, and she sees a glass case with her love letters to Conway Twitty from the 50s or whatever. Like, and she has this moment where she's like, hey, that's my mail. Like, I sent that to him. How are you able to auction this? So she just goes to like open this glass case and pull her letters out and be like, these are mine. And there's police officers there to like, just as security or whatever. And they kind of have this moment where they have to go to Conway's ex-wife and be like, ma'am, you got to put those back. They're part of the auction. They've already been itemized. Like, she's like, well, these are mine. They have my name on them and I mailed them to him. Like, this is my stuff. And they're like, sorry, ma'am, no, it's not. And you got to put those back. So she does. And those get auctioned off with the rest of everything else. And this is where you have like other people in the room just like going to his kids and handing them money. Like, here's $300 to buy the next thing that was coming up. Or like, so the camps of people really start to sort of develop. A lot of people seem to have felt like Dee was in the wrong here for triggering this auction, and they're trying to help the kids get pieces of memorabilia for their dad, which seems like a decent thing to do. And but like I said, it's just a nasty. I don't think that relationship's ever healed from that, because the legal battle continues on. Like, they kind of sort of settle for, like later as far as his like name and likeness and intellectual property stuff. They do kind of get like legal settlements with a clean line of whose is whose. And so, but to the point where like this was nasty enough that the daughters go to the Tennessee state legislature, unrelated. So like this isn't going to impact their case at all because the law is what it was at the time. But they get brought to the Tennessee legislature and they tell their story about like the way you guys have the current inheritance laws in Tennessee. This is what we've been put through. And it's so moving to the Tennessee legislature. Some of them are crying during their testimony, and like at the end, they're getting hugs from people like, we're so sorry this is happening to you. They actually, from their testimony, go to amend the laws in Tennessee for inheritance stuff. Like, so now it's now in Tennessee, if that happens, the current wife is only entitled to X percentage, and it's relative to how many years she was married to the person in question. That came, I think they might call it the Conway Twitty law or something. Like it's their testimony had so much of an impact that it actually gets a law changed in Tennessee because Dee was just crushing them on the inheritance front. So, like I said, that all gets really complicated and sad and weird. And it's, everybody agrees that whole process would have just broke Conway's heart because he was such a family dude and he was trying to build this like paradise for his kids that would have lasted after he died. He sort of imagined this like happy little village of the Jenkinses all running around together. And it just gets shattered by his death and the probate process and everything else. There's also a bunch of questions about the executors of that will and how they were behaving, because they, in the same meeting, or I don't know if it's the same meeting, but like soon after, they have this meeting and they tell everyone, hey, your money's cut off and like you got to move now because we're auctioning off your homes, and like, you guys don't have an income, you don't have a house, anything you want from your dad, you now have to buy back. And then they turn right around to Dee and they hire her as an advisor. So the estate is now paying Dee a salary to help them, because she was, the thought process, I guess, is that she was very involved in the music business. She understood royalties. She understood, where all the different projects were and what Conway's role was and different things. So she was like because she was there the whole time, she was a useful person to have in this process. So she ends up with a job out of this deal as like an administrator figuring all this stuff out. But you can kind of see the conflict of interest there because that creates a strange dynamic. So she is helping the executors figure out exactly how much money there is to be distributed between her and the kids, and it just turns into this nasty deal. Then there's a rumor that there is $80 million that just went missing. There's newspaper clip. I can't remember the magazine that ran it. But anyway, there's headlines of like Conway's missing millions, and the theory was that he had offshore accounts with like $80 million in it that just vaporized after he died, and nobody knows where that money went. That article catches the IRS's attention, and they go knocking on doors. So you can imagine now being Kathy at home in this years-long legal battle, and then the IRS shows up and is like, hey, we think you might owe us a lot of money because there's $80 million that might have gone missing. And so now she's having to like defend herself from that and figure out, and I don't think anything comes of that. Like I don't know what the sources on that article were, but the IRS is not able to locate that money or apply a tax to any of the parts of the estate. So like the missing millions stay missing if they ever existed. But there's also, like one of them said that the year that he died, Conway made $3 million. Where'd that money go? Nobody knew. Like, they were just told, hey, your salaries can't be paid anymore. And it's like, well, he just made $3 million. Like, where'd all the money go? And they don't ever get clean answers on that. So the best they're able to end up with is the kids get the rights to his intellectual property and his image and likeness and all that stuff. Dee gets, she ends up with like a couple $1 million out of this deal, I think. But like I said, just such a sharp contrast to the life that Conway lived, where he had this like happy family and everybody's doing good. He's achieving all his goals. He builds this little mecca for his, descendants. And then as soon as he dies, unraveled and completely falls apart. The family crumbles. Lines are drawn. People are picking sides. It's just a disaster, which is endlessly tragic. But anyway, he's still, memorialized today as one of the greatest country music artists to ever do it. And, as an artist, like I said, his ability to hang in there through all the changes in music across decades and just keep working and keep cranking out hits and keep, winning awards. And he was the example of a guy who didn't ever fall to like the rock star life. He didn't get into the drugs. He didn't like, this didn't happen to him because he made mistakes. He seems to have done everything right and been a stand-up guy and like never fell into the same traps that all these other artists that we talk about have. And in the end, you know, it still fell apart because of just money and, you know, people getting greedy. But not to end on too much of a downer note. Like I said, he had a very cool life and career. And, you know, by the time he died, he was happy. He was, you know, he was experiencing a pretty positive time in his life when it ended. So, yeah, I think despite the aftermath being kind of tragic, Conway lived a good life. He had a good career. He crunk out some of the best, you know, country music of the genre, really, because, you know, because it spanned so many of the decades and he worked with so many people and just left a really positive mark on the business. So, but yeah, that's Conway Twitty. So thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you next week.